There is a graph that runs along the wall of more or less every climate science building on the Earth. It goes up. That's the whole graph. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere measured continuously at an observatory near the summit of Mauna Loa starting in 1958. It's called the Keeling Curve, after Charles David Keeling, the man who decided somebody should probably be writing this number down. If you zoom in on the early part of that curve, though, there's a gap. A few months in 1964 where the line just isn't there, not because the atmosphere stopped having carbon in it, but because the U.S. Weather Bureau took a budget cut, the instruments broke, and there was no money to fix them. Keeling spent the next 30-odd years fighting the same fight. Funding threatened in the 60s, threatened again in the 80s. He fought to keep the record alive, and in his autobiography, he wrote down what he'd learned from the experience, which is a very polite way of saying nobody wants to pay for the boring part. The boring part being continuing. Keep that gap in mind. We're going to come back to it. Now, this is a video about a different long-running measurement taken in a different place by people who now supplement its budget with an OnlyFans account. The account is called OnlyMarms. The bio reads, and I want to be clear that this is a real quote from a real page maintained by a real research university, unfiltered yellow-bellied marmot content from the Rockies. It is exactly what it sounds like and nothing more than what it sounds like. Photos and videos of wild marmots. Eating, digging, sitting, being fat. And the argument of this video is that the OnlyFans account is the least strange thing about this story. The strange part is what it's paying for, why that thing is irreplaceable, and what it just finished measuring. Let's start with the mechanics of the operation because they're funnier than the premise. The marmot study runs out of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, a field station outside Crested Butte, Colorado. It was started in 1962 by a biologist named Kenneth Armitage, who ran it for 39 years before handing it to UCLA's Daniel Blumstein. It is the second longest continuous study of individually marked wild mammals on the planet. First place is Jane Goodall's chimpanzees. And second place is now a group of very fat rodents in Colorado who have been individually named, weighed, and followed since the Kennedy administration. In 2025, the grant's funding network were canceled. Not reduced, just canceled. This was a part of a broader federal science rollback in which more than 7,800 NIH and NSF grants were canceled or suspended, and the number of new NSF grants fell about 25% below the previous decade's average. So the lab did what any research operation does when a 63-year-old data set is suddenly unfunded. It filed appeals, applied for grants, partnered with a local brewery on a marmot-themed beer, declared something called Fat Marmot Week, and put the marmots on OnlyFans. The page is maintained by a first-year master's student named Emily Renke. Subscriptions are free. It just runs on tips. And here's where the story stops being a headline and starts being an accounting document. Because when a reporter asked Blumstein how much money it had actually raised, he gave the only honest answer available. 2 words. As of about a month in, 735 page visits, 44 fans. And on whatever those 44 people tip, OnlyFans takes 20%, and then Blumstein pays taxes on what's left. So the continuity of the second longest mammal study in the world is now partially underwritten by a revenue stream that gets skimmed by a subscription platform and then taxed by the federal government that just defunded it. Somewhere, there's a budget line where that math is considered a solution. But an absurd funding mechanism is only interesting if the thing on the other end of it is worth funding. So, what does 64 years of counting marmots actually buy you? The answer starts with hibernation, which is a much stranger process than the word suggests. A hibernating marmot isn't sleeping. It's running a controlled, months-long shutdown where their body temperature drops near freezing, their heart rate slows down to a few beats per minute, and their metabolism is throttled down to the minimum required not to die. It spends roughly 8 months underground doing this, on nothing but the fat it managed to put on over one short alpine summer. Which means a marmot is essentially an animal running a fixed annual budget. It earns fat in the summer, it spends fat in the winter. If the spending outpaces the earning, the animal doesn't go into debt, it just doesn't come out of the burrow. Now here's the part that makes marmots useful. Everything about that budget is set by mountain weather. When the snow melts determines when the marmot can start eating. How long the summer runs determines how much fat it can bank. And how deep the snowpack gets determines how well the ground is insulated while it's down there. Because the snow is not the marmot's problem, the snow is the marmot's blanket. So a marmot, in other words, is a thermometer that eats wildflowers. Now point a research program at that thermometer for half a century and you get numbers no climate model could generate on its own. Spring temperatures at the site have risen roughly 5 degrees Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit over 50 years. Spring snowpack has dropped by about 50 centimeters or 20 inches. And the marmots responded exactly the way an animal on a budget responds to a longer earning season. They started waking up earlier. One analysis clocked emergence about 38 days earlier than it had been 23 years prior. Longer summers, more foraging, more fat. They got bigger. They had more pups. More of those pups survived. The population grew. For 4 decades, if you read only the summer numbers, the yellow-bellied marmot looked like one of the few clear winners of climate change. Warmer world, fatter rodents, more of them. The marmots were, on paper, thriving. But in 2020, researchers ran the survival data by season instead of by year. 40 years of it. And the two halves of the marmot's calendar were moving in opposite directions. Summer survival was going up, exactly as the fat and happy story predicted, but winter survival was going down. The paper's conclusion was that continued warming could, in their words, tip the energy balance for the species. The earning season was improving, and the spending season was quietly getting more expensive. Which is the sort of finding that is completely invisible on any timescale a normal grant cycle can see. A 3-year study of these animals in the 1990s would have reported accurately that the marmots were doing great. A 5-year study in the 2000s would have reported accurately that the marmots were doing great. You cannot see a slow divergence between two seasonal trends by looking at either season for a short time. You can only see it by standing in the same meadow for 40 years, writing down which specific, individually named animals failed to come back up. Therefore, the study wasn't just measuring marmots. It was measuring the gap between what the summer says and the winter says. And this past winter, the winter finally spoke up. Colorado went into the winter of 2025 and 2026 with record low snowpack, which on a ski report is a bad season. On a marmot's balance sheet, it's the removal of their blanket. Without insulating snow, the ground froze hard. The animals underground had budgeted fat for a normal winter and were now heating an uninsulated burrow. On top of that, the previous winter's low snow had suppressed the wildflower bloom they had earned their fat from, and an early melt had left them exposed to predators for longer. The team went into that winter tracking about 160 marmots. By spring, they had about 60. More than 100 animals, most of them named, many of them from lineages the study had followed for decades, and they didn't come out of the ground. Blumstein called it the second biggest die-off in the history of the project. And this is the part I actually want you to sit with. That die-off is not just a sad wildlife story. It's a data point, and it's a legible data point, one that means something, only because 64 years of context exist behind it. Without the record, 100 dead marmots is just a bad winter. With the record, it's the winter survival trend line arriving. The 2020 paper predicted that continued warming could tip the energy balance. 5 years later, a record low snowpack tipped it, and there was a research team standing in the meadow with a 64-year baseline to recognize what they were looking at. That recognition is the entire product. That's what the grants were paying for. The grants that were canceled the same year. That leaves them needing their 44 fans, 735 page visits, free subscriptions, tips accepted, minus 20%, minus taxes, a themed beer. One first-year master's student uploading footage of a large rodent standing on a rock, in the hope that enough strangers on the internet find it charming enough to fund the continuation of the second longest mammal study on Earth. Oh, and there's also genuinely a Fat Marmot week. Here's what makes long-term ecological research different from almost everything else that gets defunded. Most canceled projects can be restarted. The work stops, people leave, it's expensive and painful and wasteful, and then, if the money comes back, you can begin again. A lapsed dataset doesn't work like that. Nobody can go back and weigh the marmots of 2027. That measurement exists only if somebody was standing in that meadow in that summer with a scale. If no one is, the number is not delayed, it's just gone, permanently. And every future analysis inherits a hole where it should have been. Which is what Keeling was actually complaining about in 1998. The value of a continuous record is the continuity. Break it, and you don't lose a year of data. You weaken every comparison that would have ever crossed that year forever, including the ones nobody has thought to run yet. The 2020 seasonal survival finding did not exist in 1962. It became possible because the record was unbroken long enough for someone to ask a question its founder never imagined. We are, right now, choosing which questions the people after us will simply be unable to ask. A gap in the record is not an absence of information. It's a permanent, specifically shaped hole in what anyone will ever be able to know. The good news is that to fill this one, it currently costs about the price of a sandwich. And the marmots have agreed to pose.